Welcome to our Encounter Bible Study for March the 20th. We have moved now from chapter 13, the beginning of the Last Supper, Jesus washing the disciples' feet, to John 18, which is Jesus' arrest. So 5 chapters, as we mentioned last week, John uses just to talk about that Last Supper. But now we're in the Garden of Gethsemane. When I was in Israel back in 2009 with a group of other pastors, I had the opportunity to go to the Garden of Gethsemane, obviously a spot most tourist groups are going to go to. And unlike many of the sites in Israel, we know that the Garden of Gethsemane, as it is now, is exactly where it was then. We know that's the actual site of the Garden of Gethsemane. And they even say that some of the trees that are there in the garden may be over 2,000 years old. They may have been young saplings, the olive trees, during the time of Jesus. Now they are huge and gnarled, but it's very moving to think that this living thing, this tree might have been there on that fateful night. Later on that night, Jesus is taken to Caiaphas's house, and Caiaphas's house was sort of like a parsonage. It was the house that the high priest could use in Jerusalem whenever the high priest was there in Jerusalem. And unlike the Garden of Gethsemane, there is some controversy as to whether Caiaphas's house is actually the place where Jesus was taken. But one of the things that gives it some credibility is that there's a dungeon beneath where the house was, and now there's actually a church over where the house was, but there's a dungeon down there, and there's a hole in the floor, and a prisoner would be lowered through by a rope down into the dungeon, and then the rope would be withdrawn, and there would be almost no chance for escape because the walls in there are smooth, and the opening is up in the ceiling of the dungeon. And it may well be that Jesus was lowered down in there and spent his last night after he was tried by Caiaphas, spent his last night down in that dungeon waiting to be taken to Pilate, waiting for Good Friday. There's a staircase now that goes down, and so you can go down into the dungeon. And when you get down there, the tour guide usually warns everybody and says, I'm going to turn off the lights for a little while and let you just get a feel for what it might have been like for Jesus to have been down in this dungeon in the dark, all alone, spending the last few hours of his last night on earth. And as we were about to undergo that experience, one of the other pastors, and I'll just never forget this, one of the other pastors on the trip just kind of remarked almost to herself, when your parsonage has a dungeon in it, you know that something terribly awry has happened in your religion. Your religion has gone terribly wrong. And John 18 and really through the crucifixion of Jesus is a testimony to how much had gone wrong with their religion, and it is a call for us to make sure that we don't let our religion go awry. So let us begin this study by seeing the visual Bible, the Gospel of John, these first few verses in chapter 18, the arrest of Jesus.
After Jesus had said this prayer, he left with his disciples and went across Kidron Brook. There was a garden in that place, and Jesus and his disciples went in. Judas, the traitor, knew where it was, because many times Jesus had met there with his disciples. So Judas went to the garden, taking with him a group of Roman soldiers and some temple guards sent by the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were armed and carried lanterns and torches. Jesus knew everything that was going to happen to him, so he stepped forward and asked them,
Who is it you are looking for?
Jesus of Nazareth.
Judas the traitor was standing there with them when Jesus said to them,
I am he.
They moved back and fell to the ground. Again, Jesus asked them,
Who is it you are looking for?
Jesus of Nazareth.
I have already told you that I am he. If then you are looking for me, let these others go.
He said this so that what he had said might come true. Father, I have not lost even one of those you gave me. Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave, cutting off his right ear. The name of the slave was Malchus.
Put your sword back in its place. Do you think that I will not drink the cup of suffering which my father has given me?
Then the Roman soldiers, with their commanding officer and the Jewish guards, arrested Jesus, tied him up, and took him first to Annas.
If you've seen a different movie, The Passion of the Christ, you may remember that there's a scene in the Garden of Gethsemane where Satan is tempting Jesus to leave it all and abandon his mission, and Satan sends forth a snake, and Jesus crushes the snake with the heel of his foot. And what the movie scriptwriter there was trying to do was to draw us back to the Garden of Eden, and to remember that God in the Garden of Eden promises the serpent, or really promises Satan, that the offspring of Eve will eventually crush Satan beneath his heel. And so that's kind of a dramatic way for that movie scriptwriter to show that. In a sense, John is doing the same thing in the gospel, we think. John is trying to help us remember back to the Garden of Eden, because John's entire purpose in the entire book has been to connect Jesus, the historical Jesus, to the Jesus who was in the beginning with God, the Word being with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And so John is doing that in this as well. The story of the Garden of Eden, of course, is a tragedy. It's a tragedy in the Greek tragedy sense of the word, where you have people who are high and lifted up and favored, and through their arrogance and their sin, they fall. And that's exactly what happens. Adam and Eve have this wonderful relationship with God, where God joins them every evening in the cool of the garden. They have this beautiful garden they can live in and eat all of the fruit, and yet through their arrogance and their sins, coming to temptation, they fall in a mighty, mighty way. That's the story. But the story of the Garden of Gethsemane that we just saw, that the little depiction of, is actually, even though you can't quite tell it yet, but it's actually the beginning of the reversal of everything that happened in that horrible tragedy in the Garden of Eden. So let's think for a moment about the Garden of Eden. In Garden of Eden, of course, Adam and Eve do fall prey to temptation. And when God comes into the Garden of Eden looking for them, what do? They hide. They're afraid. They don't want to see God. In the Garden of Gethsemane, we know Jesus is tempted to run away. He's tempted to hide, and yet he doesn't abandon his mission, does he? He doesn't succumb to temptation. Who comes into the Garden of Eden? Well, it's not God, it is violent men. And they're coming under the cover of darkness, not in the cool of the evening, but under the cover of darkness. And they think they are doing God's work. They've been sent by the high priest, after all, and yet, in fact, of course, they aren't. They also have fallen prey to temptation, just as the high priest has. His arrogance, their arrogance, causes them to lose sight of who God really is, and they cannot see all of these signs that Jesus has shown them to prove that indeed he is God. They've missed all of those signs because of their arrogance, and now they are going to fall rather than he, even though we don't see that, of course, initially. They believe that they can do God's work with violence and coercion, and they think they're more powerful than Jesus, and they're going to find out otherwise, although it's going to take a little bit. Adam and Eve hide when God comes seeking them in the garden, but when these violent men come seeking Jesus, he doesn't hide. John's very clear. He steps forward. He stands right up to them, and he says, "Who are you seeking?" And they say, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he says, "I am he." Now that isn't an accidental answer. We've been talking about this lots in the Bible study. Every time Jesus says, "I am," whether it is, "I am the bread," or "I am the living water," or "I am the way and the truth and the life," those words, "I am," are very important. When Moses first encounters God and says to God, "What is your name so that I can tell Pharaoh, I can tell our people?" God's response is, "I am." And so Jesus says, "I am He." And in John's gospel alone, this amazing thing happens. The men step back and then they fall down. These are guards. These are heavily muscled men with their swords and their torches, and they're ready to arrest this single unarmed man. And yet when he says, "I am He," they fall down. Now this may just be supposed to be a comedic moment. They're the Keystone Cops and they fall all over themselves, but I think there's more to it going on here. They don't even recognize it. They don't acknowledge it, and yet they are in the presence of God. And what do people do when they're in presence of God? They fall down, both in fear and in respect. It's why we kneel, because we are kneeling before God, recognizing that we respect God so much and even fear God in the positive sense of that word, the fear that we know that God is greater than us and we want to do God's will. Well, they fall down and fall back, but quickly they recover. You wonder if Satan is whispering in their ears, just as Satan has already whispered into Judas's ear. And so they step forward again, Jesus asking again who he's seeking, and they say again that that they're seeking Jesus, and he says, "I've already told you who I am." So what happens? Well, in the Garden of Eden, let's go back again. Adam and Eve kind of bargain for their lives. They tell half-truths and they make excuses. Eve says, "The serpent gave me the fruit. The serpent told me to eat the fruit. It's not my fault. Punish the serpent." And then Adam that does that horrible, really the first ever human betrayal of human, when Adam says to God, blaming really both Eve and God, "That woman, the one that you gave me, she gave me the fruit and I ate it." And Adam is essentially saying, "Punish her, don't punish me." The men come to Jesus, and what does he do? Does he bargain for his life? No. He says, "I am the one that you have come for, and so you don't have any need to take these other men. Let my disciples, let my followers go." He doesn't say, "Why don't you take Peter? Why don't you take John?" No, he just says, "Let them go." And John tells us that's to fulfill the prophecy that not a hair on any of their heads was harmed. And so they take Jesus and they go, and Jesus recognizes that he is giving himself. He's already in a sense demonstrated when he says, "I am," and they fall down. He could overpower them all by himself, not in some kind of a ninja way, but simply because indeed he is God. And yet he knows that he is here because it is his job to begin the reversal and ultimately to enact the reversal of what happened at the Garden of Eden. And so we have Paul telling us in 2 Corinthians 5:21, "For our sake he made him to be sin who knew no sin." Jesus becomes sin. Jesus takes the punishment of sin, the punishment meted out to Adam and to Eve and to you and to me. Jesus becomes sin, the one who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. We might be restored to full righteousness, just like Adam and Eve were before they ate the fruit. We too can be restored because of the work that Jesus does, and he does it by going out of the garden with these men, not by hiding, not by running away, not by making excuses or trying to get somebody else in trouble, but by accepting what he doesn't have to accept upon himself. But there is another moment of action in the Garden of Eden I want us to think about, and in the Garden of Gethsemane. In the Garden of Eden, God sets an angel with a flaming sword at the gates of the Garden of Eden so that humans cannot enter again into the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter takes out a sword, and he uses it, I suppose, slashing out at the person closest to him, the high priest slave named Malchus, cutting off his ear. And what Peter is doing essentially is trying to use the sword to prevent Jesus and perhaps even himself from being taken out of the garden. And so the sword, rather than keeping people from coming in, he's trying to use the sword to keep people from being taken out of the garden. But Jesus immediately turns on him and says to him that he's going willingly. And he says, "Put your sword back in its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" Jesus understands, I'm going to leave the garden. In a sense, I'm getting ejected from the garden. I have become sin, even though I know no sin. I have known no sin. I have not ever committed a sin. I am now becoming sin, and I'm getting ejected from the garden. But I'm getting ejected from the garden not for all of eternity, but in order that I might drink the cup that my Father has given to me, that I would accept the consequences of human sins, so that I might then be able to offer life back to everyone. The disciples, the soldiers, the Pharisees, the chief priests, none of them understand what is happening, but Jesus does. And I liken this a little bit to what C.S. Lewis does in the book, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe part of the first book in the Chronicles of Narnia. Aslan is the great lion, the son of the everlasting king. And so you can hear in Aslan's title that he is a representative of Jesus. He is an allegory for Jesus. And he is killed. He gives his life for Edmund the traitor, and the White Witch thinks that she has won by killing Aslan, and yet Aslan is raised from the dead. And when he first speaks to the two girls, he says to them, though the witch knew the deep magic, there is a magic deeper still, which she did not know. Her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time. But if she could have looked a little further back, into the stillness and the darkness before time dawned, she would have read there a different incantation. She would have known that when a willing victim who had committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack and death itself would start working backwards. The witch knew the deep magic. The witch knew the consequence of sin is death. The wages of sin is death, as Satan did. And so Satan knows if he can tempt us into sin, he tempts us into death. But Satan is a part of creation as well, as was the White Witch. And so Aslan says, if she could only have looked a little further back to before time began, she would have known there's an even deeper magic than the wages of sin is death. And that is, if an innocent victim gives his life willingly for those who are not innocent, but those who are guilty of treachery, then the stone table cracks. That's the stone table with the law on it, and death begins to work backwards. Isn't that a beautiful story? Isn't that a beautiful example of exactly what is going on here in the Garden of Gethsemane? The chief priests and the Pharisees and the scribes and even the disciples think that by Jesus being taken, that death is having its way, that sin is going to win. He has been ejected from the garden, and now their hope is gone. But he knows of that deeper magic. Why? Because in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He can see farther back than Satan, farther back than any of us. But of course, before we get to death working backwards, we have a little ways to go. We're still in the throes of Lent, and we are supposed to be. And so let us not rush too quickly to Easter, but stay here in the garden, focusing on what is going on here. And in doing so, let us consider and contemplate and ponder these truths. The first truth is that Jesus is God. That is one we just need to ponder and sit with. That God promises all the way back at the Garden of Eden that He and He alone is going to fix the mess that human sin has caused. We can't fix it, but God promises even back there at the Garden of Eden to fix it. And that Satan and all who listen to him are wrong, including when we listen to him. Even the broken, fallen world that we live in doesn't work the way that they think it does. They see Jesus as this poor, misguided soul, weaker than them and threatened by their power. They have it all backwards. They have it all backwards. Jesus is willingly giving His life. And so in the meantime, let us also give of our lives, not to Satan, not to temptation, but give our lives to Christ. Jesus tells us to love our neighbor and to pray for those who persecute us. And the world howls in laughter. What a ridiculous thing to do. Jesus tells us that in order to save our lives, we must lose them. And the world begins to sharpen their swords. Jesus tells us that if we want to be our disciples, we must deny ourselves. We must pick up our crosses and follow Him. And the world gets ready to pound the nails into us. But because of Jesus, we know the deeper magic. We know as he told the disciples just a little while before this, you are in the world, but you are not of it. And that is because of the Garden of Gethsemane. That is because Jesus has now begun the work of reversing that deep magic that began in the Garden of Eden, but that will be overthrown by the deeper magic that Jesus and Jesus alone knows. So let us sit with that this week and the next couple of weeks and continue to contemplate these truths as we prepare ourselves for Easter. And we do all of these things, of course, because God is